How's it going, Eliminators? Today, we're going to be discussing why estimates are always subject to change. So let's get right into it. So today's video is going to be all about quotes and how they are subject to change. And I'm just going to kind of explain, the process of that, what I go through on a day-to-day basis, and kind of defend a mechanic's position if they were to call you back and say, I know that I quoted you this much, but it might be a little bit more. So today I'm going to try to explain that the best I can. And I'm going to use this snowblower here to help me explain that, because it is literally a perfect example. So you guys can see that this thing is, already taken apart. There's lots done to it, and I'm going to go over pretty much everything. But today we're going to be talking about this Yardworks 24-inch snowblower here. This thing, as you guys can see from just the paint absolutely falling off of it, the amount of rust that this thing has probably sat outside for many years. It is in very rough condition, and my customer wasn't sure if they wanted to fix it or not, because they knew right away that it was probably going to be quite a bit to fix it, to get it to the point where, it's Eliminator performance standard of this thing's going to be reliable and I can give you my guarantee on my work. So my customer, like many other customers that I have, asked me if I would give them an estimate on what it was going to cost. Now, in order for me to give a customer an estimate, I have to factor in the price of parts and also labor. The amount of parts I need will then determine how long I'm, roughly going to spend on a machine. But in order to give that estimate, I must first do a basic diagnostic outlook or assessment of the machine to see, what all parts I'm going to need, and then factor in how much labor is going to be required to go ahead and replace those parts. Now, this snowblower, like I said, it's a perfect example because it sat for a long period of time without running. One of the first things I did was check the oil, needed an oil change. So right away you factor in the cost of oil and the labor it would take to drain and change the oil. And I opened up the fuel cap and just put my finger in there to determine, what kind of fuel it had. And it smelt like really old, watered down Varsol. So I could tell right away that it was probably a low grade ethanol based fuel. And there's definitely some water in there, which then leads me to the carburetor. Now, you guys are going to notice right away that this thing has, a couple stacks of nuts on there. These machines you kind of have to pull apart to get at the carburetor. So what I determined was that once I figured there was at least some oil in there, I went ahead and pulled it, checked for spark, and there was spark. So I told my customer that, yeah, this thing's probably worth doing a carb clean on. So, oil, fuel, and then go ahead and clean and rebuild the carb. And I quoted him on a price of cleaning and rebuilding the carb because of what the fuel looked like. I figured the carb was going to be really bad. Plus the state of this snowblower, it's not all that great. So I'm assuming that old fuel sat in that thing for quite a while. And basically what I did was I ended up getting to the point where the carb has been clean and rebuilt. You go ahead and pull this thing and it fires right up. Now, the little nuts stack here, that's been put on there to hold the carburetor up against the engine so that I don't have to go ahead and put all of this stuff back on. Because if there was any issues, I want to be able to address it without having to disassemble everything. And sure enough, there was an issue, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But one of the things that I wanted to point out is this right here. So if we can look here, well, that's not your typical auger cable. That is like a shoestring. So someone at some point has replaced a broken auger cable with just a pull cord or a shoestring. And then another thing that I do for my basic assessment, flip the machine up, pull off the access panel at the bottom, and inspect the friction wheel. One of the things that I did was just to check, make sure that it rolls, which it does in fact roll, and then go ahead and engage the drive and try to roll it again, and it doesn't, which let me know that at least there was good tension on the friction wheel. And when I flipped it up and had a look at the friction wheel, you could still see there was quite a bit of meat, as they say, left on that friction wheel, which is just a good amount of rubber still left on that friction wheel. So it's not like that had to be replaced. And I'm going to assume that this thing does drive. But, seeing something like that string instead of the proper auger cable is a clear sign that someone else has worked on this, and that person that worked on it probably wasn't a professional mechanic, because, somebody like me is going to go ahead and take that auger cable right out of my inventory, or, order one and then replace it because that's the right proper part to do it. Not to go ahead and just cut a piece of rope or string or whatever and kind of jerry rig things, as they would say. So, as I'm doing my assessment, I'm going to say, listen, you need some fresh fuel, you need oil, you need a carb clean. And that's going to take a certain amount of time, and it's going to be a certain amount of money in parts. And that assessment takes me time to put together. So I have to physically go ahead and, take some things apart on your piece of equipment. I'm going to have to get a list of what kind of parts your piece of equipment may need. Now, once I have that list of parts, I then have to go into my computer program and put together a cost associated with those parts. And then, like I said, I'm going to have to factor in the amount of time that I would have to spend to go ahead and replace those parts. And then I have to add all that together. So you could assume that it's going to take me time. And on the average kind of assessment or diagnostic that I do on a machine, it could take me anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes, maybe even a half an hour. So my basic diagnostic fee is going to be about $35. Now, if I get back to you and I say this machine's going to cost X amount of dollars to, get to the point where it's going to be reliable, and I could give you a guarantee. If my customer then says that's too much money, I don't want to put that into this thing, to me, it's not worth fixing for that much, then what I would do is charge them a $35 diagnostic fee. That covers my time that I spent to give them that estimate. And then at that point, we could discuss whether they would want the machine put back together, if it was disassembled, for me to do my diagnostic. And depending on, how in-depth I had to go, if it was a, auger gearbox issue, I would have to take it apart to see the amount of damage. As you can see in previous videos that I did on gearboxes, that requires quite a bit of disassembly. The back half and the front half have to be split. You have to pull out the auger assembly from the auger housing. So that's quite a bit of work to do to establish how much damage is done inside of there, and maybe it's just a worm gear that needs to be replaced. In the case of this machine, I said to my customer, let's just start out with a basic carb clean and see if I can get this thing to run. That was our initial starting point. So the carburetor was cleaned, some fresh fuel was put in the tank, fresh oil change, and then I went ahead and just stacked up those nuts there to go ahead and hold the carburetor up against the engine. And now when you pull the cord, this thing fires up every time, guaranteed. However, there is no tension on the throttle when you throttle up the lever. So right now, we should be in the farthest position this way, which should be applying the maximum amount of tension on the governor arm, which is hidden under this fuel tank, which we're going to get into in a second. So what's happened in the case of this engine is either the governor has adjusted itself to a position that does not allow the spring to put tension onto it, which, I have to explain to my customer is highly unlikely. I generally never have to adjust a governor on one of these engines. Or whoever worked on this before, that may have been the one that, put this string here, could have possibly messed with the governor and not knew exactly what they were doing and got it to the point where it is now. And the point where this snowblower is now is that, like I said, when you pull that handle, this thing fires up. However, it just doesn't rev out. You can go ahead and throttle it up, throttle it down. The RPM remains the same. And that's because the governor doesn't have any spring tension to allow the engine to throttle itself up. Basically, my customer was quoted, a certain amount of money to go ahead and fix this piece of equipment. But as I did the work, I then uncovered more issues with the engine, which is going to be the governor, and then had to explain to my customer that there's going to be more labor associated with the repair. So from a mechanic's point of view, the first initial job was to do the assessment, and then the customer asked that, the mechanic basically gets the equipment running. And this could be similar to, like, let's say a car. You bring a vehicle, maybe a car or a truck, into your auto mechanic, and let's say it has a bad fuel pump. So the initial job would be to get the engine running so that when you turn that key, the engine starts up. So the mechanic would give you a basic cost of the fuel pump itself plus the labor, and you would okay that repair. So you could get a call back from your mechanic maybe later that day or the next day, and they kind of explain to you, we have good news and bad news. The good news is that when you turn the key, the engine starts up. So, just like it was asked of us, we have the engine running. However, the bad news is that the engine may not be running all that well. In the case of a car or a truck, it could be related to, let's say, a misfire in a cylinder due to a bad coil pack. And at which point the quote would be updated to then get the engine to run reliably. So even though it starts, that's one thing, getting it to run efficiently is another. And that is basically what's happened here. So in the case of this snowblower, like I said, the engine runs, but it requires further work. And unfortunately, the governor system is hidden underneath this fuel tank. Now this fuel tank here is bolted from the outside here, but it's also bolted from the other side of the fuel tank. And those bolts are incredibly difficult to get at because you have this big exhaust shield here. And to get that off, well, you have to then disconnect the chute tower, because the way that MTD has designed this is there's a bolt that holds that heat shield onto the engine block, and it's hidden by this tower here. So essentially you have to remove this chute tower, then you can go ahead and remove this heat shroud, and then I can get better access at the bolts on that side of the fuel tank to then just pull the fuel tank off, and then that will give me access at the governor system, because I don't want to be struggling while I'm trying to make a governor adjustment, and I'm going to have to make that adjustment on this machine so that I can get proper tension onto the governor spring. Now, thankfully, the majority of my customers are great. They say you do whatever you need to do, you get that thing fixed up. But a lot of customers are going to be maybe new customers, and some might be elderly customers who have dealt with people in the past that may not have been as stand up as myself. They may have trust issues with a mechanic possibly taking advantage of them in the past. So they're always going to be leery about new experiences. So if I were to give them a quote and then say, it's going to be a little bit more than what we agreed on, they could always have that thought in the back of their mind that maybe things aren't on the up and up as everyone else says they are. So it's always nice for me to be able to refer back to my Facebook review, which I think I have a 5 out of 5 star on Facebook, and I believe I have like a 4.8 out of 5 star review on Google. But I never really rely on just those numbers. I always try to tell new customers that if you're ever unsure about, using me as your mechanic, go ahead and read some of those comments, those reviews that people have left. Those are real customers, and they've left some really incredible comments about myself, my business. And like I said, you treat a customer right, you're honest with them, and they will spread the word. You do a good job for people, and they appreciate that, and they tell all their friends and family that you're the guy they should go to. Now, a lot of you guys may not know this, but I am from Canada, and somebody had messaged me on Facebook through my business page, and they sent me a video, and basically it was their snowblower running. They got on the auger, and there was a really loud knocking noise coming from right here. They said, "What is that? I'm really scared. I hope I didn't blow the engine." And I said, that sounds to me like you bent one of the fins, the auger fins, in your second stage. I said, what you can do is with the engine in the off position, go ahead and rotate that around to the point where you hear it, and then go through your chute opening right there, and you can take a piece of wood with a hammer, and you can bend that back in. Because what it sounded like to me was a typical sound that a snowblower will make when you engage the auger, and one of those second stage auger fins is hitting the housing. So my customer went ahead and did that, gave it a few taps on one of the fins that had bent out due to a chunk of ice going in there, and he was able to fix his snowblower. So this guy gets back to me the day later, completely thrilled that his snowblower now works and doesn't make the noise, sends me a video of the thing running, he's throwing snow, totally happy, and he went ahead and left a very nice review on Facebook. But basically he said that I was able to help him from over 700 miles away, and he said that, totally professional, took like 5 minutes out of my time to go ahead and do that. And having reviews like that definitely helped me when there's a customer that is going to be a little bit leery that I've called them back and said, hey, I'm going to have to update my quote. I've discovered some new information, and it's going to require, a few more parts or a little bit more labor to get this thing running. Because again, a lot of customers are going to be leery So those honest reviews from people that I've dealt with in the past kind of help reinforce the fact that I'm an honest mechanic. And that's just one of the reasons why I wanted to do a video like this, to kind of explain a mechanic's, situation and kind of defend the mechanic's position that not all mechanics are out to, kind of rip you off, and that we do experience things like this where we learn some new information, and then obviously the quote is going to be updated at that point. But yeah, this is just something that I wanted to film. Like I said, not that exciting of a video, but when you have a snowblower like this that's just sat for so long, it's in really rough condition, the price kind of keeps going up when you got to fix these things, because you're always going to run into all these little things. And then just to wrap things up, going back to that diagnostic fee of about $35, like I said, that all takes time, and I'm entitled to get something for my time that I put into it. Now, if you say, go ahead and fix it, I will waive that diagnostic fee of $35. So now you're only paying for the repair. But in the case of this snowblower, for all the work that it would need to be done, maybe around $220, maybe a little bit more, that's probably going to be worth it to fix something like this. Now, believe it or not, I ran the model number on this unit here, and it comes up as a 2014. So, I've seen some older Craftsmans from the 80s with paint in better condition, and again, that's because this thing has been neglected, probably left outside. But for a machine that's only 6 years old, I know we're in 2021, but it's only January, so this thing's only really 6 years old, and it's requiring quite a bit of work. So I know right away it's been run hard, it's been left outside, not well maintained and neglected. So for a customer, I have to try to explain this, that if this was something that was taken care of, it wouldn't have all these issues. And I use, all of these things to reference and to help me explain that to a customer. So at the end of the day, what may be worth it to someone to fix may not be worth it to another. So if I say this is going to cost $250 to fix, I don't know how much my customer spent to purchase this. I don't know if they purchased it new 6 years ago. I don't know if they purchased it used last week. I don't know if they purchased it a year ago and maybe just had somebody work on it. Who knows? But at this point, if it was my machine, $250 to go ahead and repair this to the point where it's fully serviced, ready to go, and I could give a guarantee on it, my customer could then hypothetically use it, let's say this season, next season, maybe the season after that, get a solid 2 or 3 years out of it. And then they could potentially sell this thing for $350. So they're netting $100 on the repair bill. Not only are they getting that money for the repair back, but they would also get $100 on top of that. So it wouldn't be a complete loss. And that's another thing that I try to explain to a customer, is that in its current state, when I got it, nothing worked. It wouldn't start, which means that nothing else works, right? It's not going to drive. It's not going to throw snow. At least now it runs, so the engine's worth saving. And at that point, like I said in my diagnostic, I just went ahead and pulled the auger lever, which puts tension on that idler arm there. And then I went ahead and just pulled over the engine recoil pull start slowly, and the augers turned, which meant that the gearbox is okay, that, that's not seized. So at that point, that kind of let me know that the rest of the system should work if we get the engine up and running efficiently. And that's what I'm working on now. The customer gave me the okay, said, you go ahead and you get that thing up and running, and let me know what it's going to cost. So like I said, guys, I just wanted to take a little bit of time today to explain a mechanic's position, and that not all mechanics are out to rip you off. Again, like I said, as we learn new information, we might have to get back in touch with you. That's what I do. I take the time to reach out to my customer and say, hey, this is what's going on with your machine. And with technology today, with texting and Facebook messaging, I can go ahead and take a picture of your equipment that I'm working on and say, wow, look at this bowl. It's completely rusted. I have to sell you a new bowl. Or, this carburetor leaks, and I can take a little video of the fuel dripping. Stuff like that, customers are really appreciative of. And at the end of the day, it just helps me explain to them a situation. And, 9 out of 10 times, they give me the okay to go ahead and do the work. And you'll get back a piece of equipment that'll work. And at the end of the day, that's all you can ask for. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video today. Again, good information to have. I know a lot of you guys aren't going to have that kind of insider mechanics perspective on, what I go through on a day-to-day basis, and how that, I have to sometimes call my customers and let them know that a repair may be more than what I previously quoted them on. But sometimes I also call my customer and say, hey, remember that carburetor that I told you was probably going to need a clean and rebuild? Well, your snowblower fired right up and I didn't even have to touch the carb. Maybe I just had to do a quick little adjustment. So now you saved money because I didn't have to tear the carb apart and do a clean and rebuild on it. That happens too. And at the end of the day, not all of them can be winners. But if you guys did enjoy the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. It really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week. Check the channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.